And I thought I would give you just a tiny bit of context before then handing the wand over to our, our experts and our, our actual, participants, unfortunately, in this experience, but to talk about this Ferguson problem a little bit. So racially discriminatory practices by the police department that was trying to actually raise revenue for the city. And I'm just gonna give you a couple of facts to tell you a little bit about that and let then our panelists to talk about it a little bit more. So according to the Fines and Fees Justice Center, Ferguson's law enforcement practices were shaped by the city's focus on revenue rather than by public safety needs. And as an example of that, between 2010 and 2014, the city of Ferguson issued 90,000 citations and summons, but there are only 21,000 people who even call Ferguson home. So we can all do that math. And between 2012 and 2014, 85% of the people who were stopped, 90% of the people who received a citation, and 93% of those who were arrested were Black, whereas only 67% of Ferguson's population is Black. Black drivers were also twice as likely as whites to be searched during vehicle stops. And in 2012, 13% of Ferguson's municipal budget was funded by fines and fees. And in 2015, Ferguson budgeted 23%, so going up 10% of its revenue from fines and fees. And city officials evaluated the performance of criminal justice actors based on the amount of revenue they produced. And then one final fact, a single missed, partial, or late payment could result in incarceration. Arrest warrants were used almost exclusively to coerce defendants into paying legal debt. The court refused to reduce or waive any outstanding payments, even when defendants were jailed for their inability to pay. In fact, the court did not even record the amount of time a defendant even spent incarcerated. And as one court staffer said, it's only 3 days anyway. So this is the Ferguson problem. And so when you hear this, you might think, Ferguson, Missouri, wow, thank goodness I live in New York. Unfortunately, that is not exactly the case. And what we're going to do today is give you a broad perspective on what this Ferguson problem is and what kind of fines and fees are being used mostly in a racially discriminatory way in order within the criminal justice system itself. And that's going to be from Dr. Alexis Harris. And then we're going to hear about somebody who has actually experienced these kinds of fines and fees, and that is from Celeste Sawyer. And then to talk about how this takes place within New York, we're going to hear from an individual who runs New York campaigns from the Fines and Fees Justice Centers, and that's Katie Adamides. So I'm going to start with Dr.
She froze.
Oh goodness, so I think Rebecca froze, so we can skip. I'll just step in. I am Alexis Harris. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Washington. And I wrote a book. I'm bad at promoting. I should have had it right next to me. But I wrote a book called A Pound of Flesh, Monetary Sanctions as a Punishment for the Poor. And in that book, I research nationally monetary sanctions, fines and fees, but I also focus specifically on Washington State. And then currently I'm just ending a 5-year research project with 7 other colleagues across the nation, examining the system of monetary sanctions within 8 states. So Rebecca's questions were going to help me sort of talk about what the system of monetary sanctions is. And so Rebecca, do you want to ask me a question, or are you back on?
I'm back on, I apologize, yeah, internet problems. So yeah, Dr. Harris, I wanted to just ask you generally, what are some of the fines and fees that currently exist within our country's criminal justice system?
Right, so there are a number of fines, and they're not just fines and fees. So I call it a system of monetary sanctions. And there are the fines that you'll get for many, and the fines are directly related to the offense by which you're either getting a citation or a conviction for. So maybe a $1,000 fine for a drug offense, and then subsequent might be a $2,000 fine. On top of that, there are fees, essentially user fees for using the criminal justice system. So in Washington State, we have a $200 conviction fee and collections fee. There are fees for the use of a public defender, and one county regularly charges $450. If you were appointed a public defender, you still pay for those services. You pay for the services of using a public defender. There's a jury fee. So if you opt to exercise your right to have a jury of your peers, you pay for that jury, and you get a discount for having 6 versus 12 in Washington State, but you still pay for both. So there's a host of fees that are associated for using the system on top of the fine. In other states, there are things called surcharges. Arizona has a 42% surcharge that is on top of everything. So if I get a $2,000 fine and fee, then they add an additional, oops, I can't do the math. They usually do 1,000, 470 on top of $1,000 on that surcharge. And if you heard Celeste talking earlier about all these different types of sort of ticky-tack fees that you're charged, that's what that surcharge goes to. It doesn't directly go, or the bulk of it doesn't directly go to the criminal justice system, but it goes to clean elections funds for politicians who are running campaigns that, you know, you get a felony conviction, you have to pay for their campaign, but you can't vote for them. So there's fines, fees, costs, surcharges, there's payment fees. If in many jurisdictions, when you go to make a payment, you have to pay to make your payment. In Washington State in 2018, we ended 12% interest on non-restitution. So you still pay 12% interest on restitution charges. There are annual collection charges. So I can go on and on. There are a lot of fines and fees in this broader system of monetary sanctions. I'll also say that this punishment option is national. It's not a Ferguson issue. It's a national issue. I think if we frame it as sort of this Ferguson problem, we tend to think that, you know, Ferguson or jurisdictions that use monetary sanctions are outliers, but in fact, this is a normal functioning role of our contemporary criminal justice system. And it's really unique in that there are several different aims, unlike other types of punishment. So there's the punishment aim, that's clear, right? It's meant to hurt people financially. It's also used as a system of accountability for individuals. So many policymakers, judges will frame it in the interviews I've done as in a paternalistic sense. I'm creating the system for these wrongdoers to be held accountable. And as such, every payment then is a representation of their remorse, right? So if they're unable to pay, they can never be held accountable. So punishment accountability, it's also a tool for social control. And surveillance. So people who owe outstanding debt have to regularly report to the court every month, sometimes weekly, depending upon the structure that's set up, and say where they live, explain their economic circumstances. And you know, they haven't changed from last month, Your Honor, but they still have to do that. And then surveillance in communities, being pulled over constantly by police. And if someone missed the summons to court regarding non-payment, they can have warrants issued for their arrest. And many jurisdictions will incarcerate because of non-payment. And they do it in a roundabout way, right? They do it in that you fail to appear, or you fail to report. And people can have, I've seen one of the jurisdictions I studied had a pay or stay process. So you would be picked up on a non-payment warrant, brought to court, and the judge would say, if you pay $300 now to quash the warrant, and that will go to your fines and fees, you can leave. If you can't pay that $300 or have someone come down and pay that, or have a credit card to put that money on, then you will stay 60 days. So pay or stay. And then so punishment, accountability, social control, and then revenue generation, which is such an odd sort of mixture with a punishment, is many particularly local jurisdictions, municipalities rely on these fines and fees to have their systems run. So we have police out there policing for profit to generate resources to keep their positions open to then again go and arrest more people who are poor and can't pay. So those are really the aims and the types of costs. And it's important to note that there's layers of systems. So this happens in traffic citations, which are critical because those can then develop into driving with a license suspended in the 3rd degree, which means you don't pay your summons to court, you lose your license. And if you're driving on sort of a driving dirty or driving without your license, then you can be picked up and even incarcerated because of that driving on that license. And it's all related to your inability to pay. So traffic citations, municipal level, superior court level. It's in juvenile courts. Minors who legally can't work are charged for the services that they receive in court. So Rebecca, I just kind of blabbed on, but I think so that's the aims, the layers, and the types are really sort of the definition of what I call the system of monetary sanctions that is operating all across the United States. Stephanie, I think she needs to be unmuted.
I apologize both to the panelists and to our attendees for that, but hopefully this will now work. And so thank you, Professor Harrison. I was wondering, you know, is there anything that you think about that I didn't describe about the Ferguson Report? And do you think, you know, what was described in the Ferguson Report really happens, you know, nationwide?
Definitely. I mean, I think the 3 main themes that came out of the Ferguson Report was the over-policing of people in Ferguson, but which happens nationally. And we can see when we talk about, and I would at this point like to acknowledge the double pandemic that we're in this moment, a health pandemic, but also a health pandemic in terms of Black people being killed via state-sponsored violence in this country. Is another pandemic that's happened since the inception of this country. But that part of that killing of people in the streets is this over policing of Black people in Black communities, in poor communities. The fines and fees, non-payment and related warrants allow the police to surveil and socially control populations and lead to these interactions. So Mike Brown, do you know what the legal term for why he was being stopped was for the manner by which he was walking in the street. He was killed for the manner by which he was walking in the street. And that's these ticky-tack citations that local police departments use to control the bodies of Black people in this country. And so the focus on revenue generating is a problem, not only for individuals who are being killed, over policed and given this debt, but it's a problem for our criminal justice system because it undermines their legitimacy. That's why there's anger and frustration towards police, because people know what they're doing in our streets and our communities. So focus on generating a revenue. The police and municipal court practices and shutting courts down so people can't go and pay, not being able to bring your kids to court so you can go and pay. I mean, there's so many different practices that the Ferguson Report found that's happening across this country that then is a disincentive for people to try and pay. And then finally, the racial bias, the practices at every level, right? From the police to the clerks to the prosecutors to the judges. And that's embedded in the very structure of our criminal justice system. So Ferguson is the United States, and the United States is Ferguson.
Wow. Okay. And then, you know, so I think we can probably, you know, guess a lot from what you've said, but what are the consequences then for people who are unable to pay them off? It sounds like incarceration is definitely one of them.
Yeah, and you know, and I never want to be on one of these panels without someone who's impacted by this system. So Celeste will be able to describe the consequences more, but I will just sort of give some buckets that I found in my research in terms of the consequences. And one is the obvious criminal justice system entanglement. Once people get these even ticky-tack citations and don't have the ability to make payment, they're stuck and I say tethered, ensnared, entangled in the criminal justice system. And I say, actually, my book, I wanted to be a permanent punishment for the poor, but the publisher thought there were too many words. But it's this permanent entrapment in the criminal justice system for many people. So the criminal justice system with the summons to courts, the warrants, and the incarceration, people just can't get out of that. And it's a differential punishment for people who are poor. Bill Gates, who lives across the lake, I don't live on the lake, but he lives across the lake from me. You know, he gets $200, he can pay it and wash his hands and walk away. But somebody who's poor solely because they're poor and they don't have that $200 that moment, they have a very different experience of punishment and justice. And I don't think that's something that a lot of us think will happen, that people are treated differently, but our justice system is like that. So the criminal justice, the economic is obvious. You know, in some jurisdictions, this goes to your credit account and affects your credit score. People I've interviewed have talked about the difficulty in securing apartments, furthering their education, buying cars, buying their kids' birthday gifts. You know, even that, like being a citizen within your family, a parent, that loss of income matters for many, many people to a great deal. And then one thing that we're looking at right now in all of our interviews is the emotional strain and stress and what this does for people's health. And that's something that we haven't talked a lot about with the criminal justice system in terms of people who are entangled in it, but how the mental stress that weighs people down. One of my colleagues called it a weighted vest, that with this debt, people walk around with a weighted vest and it affects them. And we talk about COVID and why in particular, African Americans have higher rates of underlying conditions. And there's research that connects hypertension and stress related to discrimination to our health. So all of these issues are interconnected. And we need to, start really, really, really caring about what we're doing in our name to people who are our neighbors.
We actually have a question from the audience. Does any state use this as a poll tax, as Florida recently tried to?
Well, yeah, definitely. That's Florida. Many states have, and in my book, I should have opened it up, but in my book, there's a table that looks at the states that allow people to vote with outstanding debt. There's a couple different issues. So in Washington State, for example, in 2009, our state legislature gave people with outstanding fines and fees a provisional right to vote. So as long as they're making consecutive payments within a certain time frame, they can still vote. But in some states, you can, until all conditions of court supervision are met, and that includes full payment of your fines and fees, you are not allowed to vote. So fines and fees definitely have set up a barrier for people. And even outside of that, many people don't know the policy that we've been interviewing, and there's a lot of fear. I don't want to go to jail for voting, if I'm ineligible. So people don't know, and then, opt out to be safe, not to vote. So we're really losing in so many ways, disproportionately people of color and poor people are losing the right to vote, are tethered to the criminal justice system and carrying this economic burden. And we're really and again, this is part and parcel of what we're seeing in this moment of our uprising of people saying enough is enough.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. And then maybe if you could just conclude about, anything about your current research findings that you think people might be interested in.
Yeah, there's a lot of different directions that we're going in with analysis. We recently, with a couple of amazing grad students that I work with, did a paper on the cost points. So my research tends to focus on monetary sanctions and what the court imposes, but we also need to think about all of the other costs that people pay related to their sentences. So if you have a DUI, you have to pay to get your car set up so you can blow to make it drive, or you have to wear an ankle monitor that monitors your blood alcohol level. You have to pay in many jurisdictions for your probation and supervision, and any drug tests, you pay for those. There's so many other cost points that people pay in addition to the fines and fees to make sure the rest of their services are fulfilled. And increasingly so, those cost points involve third-party private entities. So collection agencies, the DUI companies, the ankle bracelet monitors, we're allowing, and it's part and parcel of American history since slavery, private companies to profit off of the social control and surveillance of individuals. In DOC's, Department of Corrections, you have JPay, right? And in some ways, that's the only way that people can communicate with their family members and maintain connections, is to buy their dang device, that they create new devices, right, every year or so, and you have to buy that new device, and then you have to pay per email or pay per picture to maintain networks. Again, allowing private people to make money off of a population that's literally controlled. So that's one angle that I think is interesting. Another research paper that we're developing right now is, in my book, I talk a lot about how monetary sanctions create poverty and exacerbate poverty. And I do that with individual level interviews, case studies, and court observations. And now we're doing a statistical analysis, and we have data for Washington, and we'll expand it. But we're doing spatial analysis of that. So in New York, they were doing these $1 million block analysis, looking at how much money governments pay to incarcerate individuals. And so millions of dollars for one block to incarcerate people from that neighborhood. I wanted to look at the amount of debt that different neighborhoods owe. And can we identify certain neighborhoods that carry a great deal of debt? And we can spatially identify neighborhoods. And guess what? Those neighborhoods are disproportionately neighborhoods with people people of color who live in those neighborhoods, and disproportionately already poor. And we also found that at time one, people get this debt that's sentenced, and 3 years later, those neighborhoods are even more poor than they were prior to getting that debt. So we see the state intervention of extraction of wealth, controlling of bodies, increasing health disparities. I mean, there's so much and all we need is our policymakers to say no more. That's all we need our state level policymakers, just to say no, and we can at least alleviate a little bit of this problem. So those are some of the directions that our research is going in at this point.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. It's incredibly useful information, and thank you for just sort of opening our eyes to the breadth of the problem. And now I wanted to move on to one of our panelists, Celeste Sawyer. We actually had a young woman who was going to join us from New York. Unfortunately, had some family health issues, but we were fortunate enough to actually, Celeste agreed to talk at almost the last moment, and so I so appreciate you coming to us, Celeste. Celeste is a mother to 5 young women, works as a freight broker in Florida. She has built a career in the logistics industry, including customer service and operations management. And so she's going to speak today about her personal experiences dealing with the burden of fines and fees in the criminal legal system in Florida. So, Ms. Sawyer, can you sort of take us a little bit through your story about what happened?
Honestly, the first part that I want to just share is that as Dr. Harris was speaking, in my head, I'm just screaming 13 mugshots, 13 mugshots. I literally have 13 mugshots for driving under a suspended license. I've never been criminalized for anything else. So 13 mugshots. Okay, sorry. But I did have time because I'm not in Ferguson. Like, I never knew any of the things that she just said applied to Florida, where I am, and I have spent the majority of my life and raising my children in Florida. I don't understand. I have never been given a ticket for speeding. I've never broken any laws. I've gone to work. I've cared for my kids, and I go home. I have silly things like movie nights and stuff. I feel as normal of a person as I can be. But stuff like that makes me feel completely abnormal, completely, especially knowing how I've personally been followed. I know I was followed. Like, I've purposely tried to avoid cops and watch them come out of a hiding place and just follow behind me, run my tag, and me knowing that, yeah, I should not have driven on a suspended license, but this is my only option to get to work. So let me try to get there. And I'm 10 and 2, and I'm smiling, and I'm behaving as normal as I possibly could. And I'm just hoping he does not pay attention to me. That wasn't for me. That was for another car. That was for someone else, until you see the lights. Then you see the lights and you're hoping, hey, please just don't take me to jail. Let it be a ticket. Let it be this and let it be that. And God forbid my kids be in the car. I've been in that position. Oh, I'm sorry. I've been in that position where my kids were in the car. And to think this all started because my daughter said hi to a policeman. It's I don't know if I can say this word, but you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because you can't win. Like, my license was fine. I was a law-abiding citizen who got my first car by myself. I got my license like I was supposed to. My mother couldn't get me a car, so I went and paid cash for my car, and I was very proud of what I've earned for myself. And I was a mom at 16. So to do this for myself, I was proud. And I picked my daughters up one day after work from daycare. They had just had career day with police and the firemen, and then sure enough, a police car pulls up next to us, and one of my twins, she's 3.5 at the time, she's in one of those booster seats. So she sits there, she takes off the top portion of her seatbelt, and she rolls down the window, "Hi, Mr. Policeman," excited as she can be because she just had a beautiful interaction with them. He then speeds in front of my car, and we're at a red light, so it's not even like we're moving. So he speeds in front of my car. I can no longer move. At this point, I am given tickets for all 5 of my children, all 5 of them, in the amount of $200 and some a piece, resulting in over $1,000. And I'm just over, "Hi, Mr. Policeman." And in my head, I'm just like, that was the worst sentence of my life, because 8 years later, I'm still paying tickets and I feel targeted. I feel used and abused. And the more I heard, it's hurtful. The more I hear, it's hurtful, because I've never done anything. I mean, I can't say I'm completely innocent, because jumping in the car, knowing that my license is suspended, that is bad. But I can guarantee that not one of the times that I stood in front of a judge and said, "Hey, judge, this is my situation," him as the power, the public defender as a power, the attorney accusing me of these crimes as the power, none of you have ever taken the time to say, "Hey, did you know that if you get your hardship license at the time that your license is suspended, and you that allows you the ability to drive as you are paying these things off." It says it very small in the handbook, very small somewhere in the handbook that I read at 16. I was supposed to remember this when I was trying to remember the road signs and stuff just to pass the test, but I was going to remember that apparently. But I was told when this year, 2020, that I sat on the phone with a habitual, it's like a judge. You get a hearing. If you're a habitual traffic offender and you want them to give you your license back, you have to have a hearing. You pay $12 and you have a hearing where they judge you all over again. So you tell them your story, and from that story, they judge whether or not you can get your license back, how much you're going to pay to get your license back, and whether or not to relieve you of the fines and fees that was associated with it. So they have the power to even stop it at that point, and they don't. They don't, because I was told pay everything plus an additional $250, plus the reinstatement fees of the D6 clearance, and then whatever it costs to get the expensive little piece of plastic, that's the end result.
And so
Hi, Mr. Policeman.
And can I ask, how long then when did that first incident occur?
February 2012.
February 2012. So for the last 8 years, you've been dealing with this, it sounds like.
Yes, ma'am.
And yeah, and there were not just the tickets, it was also court costs, is my understanding. Like, what else were they sort of making you pay money for?
Everything happened from the court costs. I can't even say everything happened from the tickets, because I won from the seatbelt tickets. The judge released everything. And I thought that I had the best friend in the world of the judge the first time that I stood in front of one. And then I was told, "Hey, we're dismissing the tickets. You don't have to pay anything with it. You just got to pay your court costs and fees and stuff associated with it. I'm like, okay, it's not the over $1,000 that they were just trying to charge me. It can't be that bad. So you go into this little room off to the side and you wait there for some more as you are about to sign your life away, is what I call it. So then they give you this yellow piece of paper that's just a note. There's no outline of anything that you are responsible to pay, no dollar amount. But yet you are committing at this point to paying that dollar amount. So you sign this paper, and then they say, okay, they're gonna discuss now the fees associated with, and then whether or not you can pay them over here at a desk. So just sit here and wait for somebody to see you at a desk. So again, you're sitting there and you're waiting, all day process, and then you talk to somebody at the desk. At this point, the lady told me that it was almost $800 to pay. And I was like, that's almost what I just got out of. Like, I don't have $800. So then she says, well, we could put you on a payment plan. So once again, you're thinking, okay, you're just trying to be my friend. So you're doing something to help me. What can you pay right now? And then the rest we'll put on this plan. I told the lady $25 is all I had on me, and I would have to try and see how I would find a ride home because I can't drive home. So she took all my $25 because she said that was the minimum. I couldn't give her a 20 and catch the bus with my $5. I had to give her my 25 and wait for 3 hours for my mom to be able to pick me up from work. Then I got on the payment plan, and I was not able to reinstate my license until the payment plan was covered. But because I didn't know about the hardship license, then in my mind, I'm going to work and I'm going to get the money to pay this $800 and reinstate my license, and everything would be fine and wonderful. And that's just not what happened.
So how has this affected your life, having over the last 8 years?
Sorry, I didn't think
No, and please, and take your time, and if if that's too big of a question, I'm happy to move on. It sounds like you have been through and just an enormous amount, and for nothing.
Right, and that's what it feels like it's all for nothing, because I'm a mom, and every day I have to look at my kids in the face and I have to tell them that the world is going to give you whatever you want if you just fight hard and you go to school and you do what you're supposed to do. But that's not right. It's a lie. I'm lying to my kids every day and telling them that the world is going to treat them the same way, and it does not matter. And the funny part is that I have a 16-year-old whose skin is chocolate. It's beautiful chocolate, okay? And she is treated completely different from my 4 kids that follow. Not to say that they're treated much better, but they do get a bit of a shot more than my oldest. My oldest, she's 16, and she has a learner's permit while her mom doesn't have a license. It's hilarious. So she will drive me around and take me to the places now that I need to go. So I'm actually falling in line behind my child and telling her, look, 10 and 2, it doesn't matter. There's no radio, there's no nothing. I don't care what things they put in this car. I don't care what happens. Everything does not apply to you. It's just not the same.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my last question for you would be, what would you like to change most about this system that has put you through this and put your kids through this as well?
To me, it's supposed to be a system to reform. So if you're going to reform us, then actually help the reformation process. So if at that point in time that I was sitting in front of the judge, tell me, get a hardship license, do this, do that, help the people. If this is what needs to be done, or you guys have, I'm sorry, not you guys, but if they have completely justified putting these things into place because this is what we need to be a society, which I don't agree at all. It makes no sense. But if this is supposedly what we need, then why aren't you actually doing the next part of it? You can't just bleed us dry and then think that we're supposed to stay in this everlasting cycle. Like, in 1 year alone, I had 6 driving on a suspended license, and it didn't matter where I was going or why. One time I was actually a passenger in my own car, but it was the only way that we could get my friend to the hospital in enough time, who was a high-risk pregnancy. It was either that or wait for an ambulance to come to the house and then the ambulance take her, and hopefully, you can't ask a mom to wait for that. Like, if she can drive herself, like she was fully, I'm gonna get in this car and drive myself. I said, no ma'am, I can't let you do that, but I will drive you to it and we're gonna get there. I got pulled over and taken to jail, and then they called the ambulance to help her while my kids were in the back seat. She's pregnant, high risk, and a passenger. Like, you don't do these things to people. You just don't. I don't understand. And what at that moment did I learn other than I can't trust a cop? I can't see you as a public servant, because if at any point in time there was a time to be a public servant, I would think that, wow, my best friend sat in the seat telling you that she's high risk pregnant, and there's obvious, I don't want to put too much of her business out there, but there's obvious signs that she needs a doctor. Why are we here? Like, you could have followed me to the hospital and arrested me afterwards, I felt like, but it was just bad, and it continues to be bad like that. So now at this point, I would say it just has to be completely just reformed. Like, whatever policies that somebody put in place is it doesn't apply to today's society. It doesn't fit with today. It doesn't fit with the people of today and how we are together. Like, it doesn't inspire us to be with one another. In fact, it would, to me, inspire more social distancing to the fullest, and it's not even due to Corona.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sawyer, for sharing us your story and letting all of us know what what it feels like to actually have to go through something, and as you said, 13 times. I want to thank both Professor Harris and Ms. Sawyer, and then move on to our final panelist, who's going to tell us about how the issues that Professor Harris described and Ms. Sawyer experienced actually do take place here in New York, and sometimes even in worse ways than they do in Florida. So Katie Adamides is New York State Director of the Fines and Fees Justice Center, an organization which works in coalition with legal system stakeholders, advocacy and community groups, and people directly harmed by fines and fees. And she advocates for reform across New York State. So Katie, I guess I would just start by saying, how do these things exist in New York, and how?
Not only do they exist in New York, but in some ways they're even worse than what we've already heard, which is hard to believe, right? Because, I mean, Ms. Sawyer, thank you for sharing your story. That was so painful, even just for us to listen to for a little while, let alone to have it happen to you. And, we here in New York do not allow payment plans, do not allow people to continue to drive with an outstanding unpaid ticket. We attach driver's license suspensions for not paying tickets. We attach driver's license suspensions for not appearing on a ticket, which, as you mentioned earlier, sometimes people are afraid to appear on a ticket, to appear to contest a ticket if they know they don't have the money. They're worried, what will happen? Well, if I don't appear and I don't pay, that's 2 suspensions, not 1. And that can happen to me over and over again. And each of those unpaid tickets represents not just the underlying fines, but also the mandatory surcharge, which is a fee that attaches in New York State to every single conviction, including traffic tickets. In some locations, there are additional local fees on top of that, and this is per ticket. And then I have to pay a fee to clear each suspension. So that's a $70 scoff fee. Scofflaw is what they call it, scoff fee. That's a reinstatement fee for the suspension. So you see how in New York, we are really punishing poverty. We are punishing poverty, and we are disproportionately policing. Those things fit together. And the way that Dr. Harris described at the top of the webinar, that this isn't exclusive to Ferguson. It's not, no one has a monopoly on this. No one has a foothold on this being their particular problem. In fact, in New York, we're doing very poorly. There are 34 localities in New York State that are about as reliant, or in some cases more reliant, on fines and fees for revenue than Ferguson, Missouri was at the time that the DOJ investigated following Michael Brown's death. Think about that. New York has an undeserved reputation for being somehow at the forefront of social progress when it comes to this arena. And I so appreciate the perspective from across the country, and how this isn't unique to one individual who made a lot of mistakes or something like that. That's not what we're talking about here. This is not a tale of personal responsibility. This is not a tale of some sort of like enlightened policy that really does work if only you understand it better. It doesn't work. It isn't right. I believe that the people who are listening to this webinar right now joined this webinar because they care about racial justice, or they care about economic justice, or they care about reducing mass incarceration. And if those are the issues that are close to your heart, then you need to understand the mechanism of fines and fees and how it fits in to the bigger picture problem that we have here in New York and across the country. And so here in New York, we do have opportunities for reform. So it's not going to be all doom and gloom for me. I just took you all the way down to the bottom there for a second, but we're doing things about this. We have real chances for reform. We have a bill in front of the New York State legislature right now, poised to pass. We are so close. And that bill would end driver's license suspensions for not paying, would end driver's license suspensions for not appearing on traffic tickets, would require affordable payment plans are offered at 2% of a person's monthly income, or $10 per month, whichever is greater. So there would be some sort of check on whether it's affordable for someone. And it would also reinstate licenses suspended for these reasons. So people could drive because they're safe drivers. None of these folks who have these suspensions were suspended for dangerous driving. We have another category of suspension for that. We have a point system for that. These are extra punishments. These are extra punishments that aren't attached to what the underlying offense was. It's a coercive tool to extract a regressive tax that is levied against the people who are most often the least able to pay. And we know that these kinds of suspensions disproportionately harm our communities of color in this state. We know that the rates for traffic debt suspensions, which is what we call them, these traffic debt suspensions, in our communities with the highest percentage of people of color are up to 4 times as high as the rates in our whitest communities. And when we look at the same comparison by income, that jumps to 9 times as high. So in our lowest income communities, the traffic debt suspension rates are 9 times as high as in our wealthiest communities. This is totally consistent with Dr. Harris's work, totally consistent with Ms. Sawyer's experience in Florida. And also, New York's current state of the law adds extra barriers on top of what we've already heard about that we don't have time to enumerate for you. But trust me, we need this reform now more than ever. Now we've got COVID-19. People need to drive to meet their basic needs without a pandemic, but then when you add physical distancing and you take away public transit as a safe option, I mean, people are in a bind. We already know that before the pandemic, 75% of drivers continued to drive on a suspended license. They need to meet their basic needs. This is how people meet their basic needs. We should allow them to drive. We have a bill in front of the legislature. We have a coalition supporting that bill. It is called Driven by Justice. If you go to drivenbyjustice.org, you can see our interactive data maps. You can look by zip code. You can see exactly how this plays out in your community. You can see how this overlays with demographic data, and you will see this is a problem that disproportionately harms our communities of color and our low-income communities. It's time for reform. If you want to join us, visit FFJC's website, so the Fines and Fees Justice Center.org. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. You can find my email addresses on the website. I am happy to have a one-on-one call with anybody on this webinar who wants to learn more about how to get involved. If your organization wants to join our coalitions, if you're directly harmed and interested in sharing your story with legislators or media, I'm happy to have those one-on-one calls to talk to folks about where they fit into this work. This is a sweeping problem. And that's just one of 3 state campaigns that folks can get involved with to help change the law in New York State. Driven by Justice is the exciting one in that it is so close. We are so close. We very nearly passed this bill last year. We were so close, and now we're still right at the edge of passing this bill. The question is what's happening with the legislature due to the pandemic. But I am cautiously optimistic. Another campaign that's definitely worth mentioning on this webinar is called No Price on Justice. No Price on Justice. So No Price on Justice is newer than Driven by Justice. That bill hasn't been introduced and we have a longer fight. But the goal is to abolish the mandatory surcharge, get rid of that fee that attaches to every single conviction, including traffic tickets. We don't need to allow this policy anymore. It's bad fiscal policy. It's not racially just. It's not economic justice. It needs to go. We want to stop commissary garnishment. So people's accounts when they're behind bars are taxed, basically, right? We take money out of the account they rely on to meet their basic needs and we give it to the state, right? This is a practice that we can end. So No Price on Justice is looking to end mandatory surcharge, is looking to end commissary garnishment, is looking to end incarceration for non-payment, is looking to end mandatory minimum fines and more. If that work fits with your mission or your organization or your experience, I encourage you to reach out to me. A third campaign, Connecting Families. Connecting Families wants to make communications from behind bars free all across the state. We know that in New York City, they made phone calls free from city jails, and that's a start. But right now, people, we watch people lose their ability to have visits behind bars. And one thing we didn't really have time to get into on this webinar is that people behind bars have fee after fee after fee after fee charged when they aren't making wages that can help them keep up with those fees. And it's coming out of their commissary accounts. We charge, I think, 37 different fees to people behind bars in New York. It's out of control. And so this campaign would at least make communication in varying platforms free. And if that fits with your mission for advocating for people behind bars, I encourage you to reach out to me. I also want to make sure that I mention that in addition to the statewide reforms that are so important and that we are working on, there are also local campaigns for reform. There is a local component to this work. Particularly if you are in Buffalo or in Long Island, these are the hot spots for bad fees practices. And we've got a problem all across the state, but in those localities in particular, there are local fees that attach on top of everything else that make this so difficult. Buffalo created 13 new fees that attach to traffic tickets, and there's a campaign on the ground to abolish those. And I'll pause here because I know we only have minutes to spare, and I want to make sure if there are any questions that have come through, we get a chance to answer them. But I so appreciate sharing this panel with these amazing speakers, and I so appreciate everybody who joined this webinar to learn about how these issues connect.
Thank you so much, Katie. And we do actually have 2 questions from the audience. The first one is, we know of bail funds we can contribute to. Can we contribute to the Fines and Fees Justice Center to help folks defray their debt?
So I love the spirit of that question because we want to relieve people of their burden. But I want to clarify that we don't pay people's fines and fees. So the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we seek to change the law so that people aren't burdened the way that they are now. We don't pay off their balances, but we understand why people need immediate relief, and that is very important. But we don't function in an analogous way to a bail fund. But when people share their stories, it really helps us change the law. We are so close, and a big part of that is being able to tell the stories of people who want to share their story and help with advocacy. So if you know people who are being harmed by this issue who do want to be part of that fight, we are happy to partner with them. As for funds, unfortunately, I'm not real helpful on that one. Although I will say there are activist organizations that are not the Fines and Fees Justice Center that I can't speak for. But I myself am a member of the National Lawyers Guild and run a chapter, and we would consider doing things like paying fines and fees, especially for activists.
And our last question is there an intersection with the town-village court problem? So
Yeah.
I might want to ask, is Paula there? I might want Paula to just clarify a little bit about what you mean by the town-village court problem. I think I might know it just about how town-village courts operate.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
So there's been a debate upstate, downstate for a very long time because the town and village courts are very local and very community run. You don't even have to be a lawyer to sit on the court. They're in people's garages, and a lot of them basically just work to get people not from the locality driving by caught in traffic traffic traps and other things like that.
That's exactly right. Yep, there are 1,300 town and village courts. It's sort of like the Wild West. I mean, there's very little oversight. We have a huge problem. The the Fund for Modern Courts put out a report detailing that problem. It's hosted on our clearinghouse as well. If you go to finesandfeesjusticecenter.org, you'll see a link to that report. And we have a huge problem with the town and village courts, and it's definitely deeply entrenched with our fines and fees issues.
Okay, so we have just about 2 minutes to spare. Are there any other questions? Oh, okay.
Dr. Harris, you looked like you had something to say earlier, and I crashed into you.
Please.
Sorry about that.
No, it was just exactly what you said, that there are some local organizations, reentry organizations, that do provide resources. At least I know in Washington State, for individuals to make their monthly payment to avoid reincarceration, and they can, start on passive education and programs and things like that. So I would look locally if you really want to help people with their fines and fees, because that would really help people move forward with their lives and disentangle themselves from the criminal justice system.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Harris. I wanted to thank all of our panelists and for the perspectives that they've given and the stories that they've told, because this is really something that, as more and more of us become aware of the problem and share it, with other activists and other people who are working within the criminal justice system, hopefully, as Dr. Harris said, we just need to change the law, and hopefully we can actually do that. And if you have any other questions, of course, you can go check out the website of the Fines and Fees Justice Center. This is something that Fortune is hopefully taking on in the next year as well. And I want to thank you for coming to the webinar. Thanks so much for your time.